All right, guys, it is a new week and we are on to a new topic. So, for all of you guys who are still sticking with me, a big pat on the back because we are now going to do more and more exciting things as we learn more and as we go along. So, today I'm going to talk about Bootstrap, and this is what's called a front end library. Now, you'll hear these words quite often: front end, back end, interface. What does it all mean? So, this cartoon is one of the ways that best represents this concept. So the front end is basically what the user sees. It's the beautiful mermaid, it's the face of your website or your mobile app. Now the back end tends to reside on the server and is basically behind the scenes, the sort of business logic of how your website or how your app is going to work. So things that it has to do. So this is where you code a lot of the functionality of the website or the app. So you've got your websites and your apps that can be designed to have a beautiful user interface and, things like animations or buttons or basically whatever the user. So you've got the databases, probably, less exciting, less pretty, but nonetheless, it's a really, really important part of any website or app because it's going to determine how everything is going to work. These two parts will need to talk to each other in order for data to be delivered. So, for example, if you're Airbnb, then in the back end, you've got your listings, you can search and query for them, and then you can deliver them to the front end, say the website or the app. Now, this division is the front end, back end division. And usually you'll see different languages being used for the front end and the back end. So on the front, we'll be using things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and this is a lot of the stuff that you see in web design. Now, on the back end, you have slightly more powerful languages like C#, Ruby, PHP, Java, Node.js, or SQL if you're dealing with databases. And this is what will enable your web apps, and it will give your website functionality, business logic, data storage, and a whole bunch of really exciting things that we're going to explore later on in the course. Now, Bootstrap is very firmly on the front end. It's a bunch of code that was written to be reusable that you can drop into your site, and it'll make designing the website much, much easier for you. Now, Bootstrap was originally developed by Twitter in order to try and get more consistency across websites that they design. But since then, they've made it free and open source. So that means you can see all of the source code on GitHub. And in fact, if you go there, you'll notice that it has a whopping 122,000 stars. And it's in fact the second most starred repository on all of GitHub. So that just shows you how popular it is. And this is definitely the most popular front-end framework or library that you will ever come across. Now, what does it allow you to do? Well, one of the most important things is that as the number of users are moving away from desktop towards mobile, a lot of websites need to be responsive. Now, this is probably not the best term for what this means because when people think responsive, they think, oh, it has to be fast or, it has to load up immediately. But actually, that's not what responsive is at all. Responsive just means that it responds to the viewport. So that means if you're looking at the same website on mobile or on iPad or on desktop, it should have a different layout to be able to best take advantage of the size of the screen real estate. So I think a better word would almost be something like adaptable layout. So your website changes its design depending on where it's being displayed. And Bootstrap makes this super, super easy, as we'll see in the coming lessons. Now, the other really awesome thing about Bootstrap is that you get access to a whole bunch of pre-styled elements that you can simply just drop into your code with very, very minimal effort. So let me show you how it works. Now, remember how in the last module, in order to create a button that was styled and it had a hover state and it looked generally nice, we had to go to CSS button generator and put in the requirements that we needed. And it generated a whole bunch of CSS code that either we had to write or we had to find somewhere like CSS button generator where it would generate this code for you. What about things that are not buttons? What if you wanted a slider or a navigation bar? Then, if there isn't a generator out there, then you would have to write all of this code yourself. Now, if we copy this code and we go over to CodePlay, and the reason why we're using CodePlay rather than CodePen is because they are a playground that allows you to include these frameworks, for example, Bootstrap and a number of other ones. So let's go ahead and create a new playground on here. And I'm going to go into the settings and I'm going to remove the Bootstrap framework. So we have no frameworks. And then I'm going to create a button as we did before, and we're going to give it a class of BTN to match what we had over here as the selector. And then I'm going to give our button, maybe let's call it Hello World. And let's go ahead and run, and then you'll see there's our button. This is plain HTML button. It looks pretty boring and pretty bland. And in order to make it look a bit nicer, we had to add all of this code in order to make it look like this and have a hover state. Now, I want to show you what you can do with Bootstrap. You don't need any of this. You don't have to write your own CSS code, or you don't have to find it somewhere and paste in snippets. All you have to do is add in the Bootstrap framework, and we're going to be working with the latest version of Bootstrap, so Bootstrap 4, throughout this course. So it's been a long time coming, and it was only really released in January 2018. So this is a fantastic time to start learning Bootstrap, because you'll be working with the latest version and the gold standard. So, if you've learned Bootstrap before, or if you have websites created using earlier versions, even Bootstrap 3 or even some of the alphas, there's been a lot of changes, and it's great that we're starting with the proper official version of Bootstrap 4.0. So now that we've selected our framework, let's go ahead and hit save. And now what we can do is we can add some classes that are predefined by Bootstrap to start styling our button. So for example, we can say that this is a button, and it's going to be a button primary. Now, if I run that code, you'll see that Bootstrap has generated this button for me with no CSS code on my part. All I needed to do was add in 3 words in order to activate those selectors so that I can get this style. And you can see that it's beautifully rounded in its corners, and it's got a hover state, and it just generally looks really, really nice with very, very minimal effort. So we can do other things as well. So for example, if I didn't want the blue one, then I can say button dark, and this will give me a nice black colored button. Now there's a whole bunch of other types of buttons. For example, button outline dark, which gives me a outline button, and when I hover it, it becomes filled. I can make it bigger by just saying button large, and that gets me a larger button. So let me show you how Bootstrap works. Now, in order to do that, we can go over to the Bootstrap website, which is getbootstrap.com, and you'll see that we've got version 4.0 selected in the top right corner. And I want you to just go ahead and download the source code for Bootstrap. And once you've done that, you should have a folder called Bootstrap 4.0 or 4.1 or whatever it may be. As long as it's got the 4 in front, then we are good to go. Now, once you open that file, you should see that there's a folder called dist, and inside here there's a folder called CSS. Now, we're going to go into the bootstrap.css, which is the main CSS file, and you're going to open it up inside Atom. Now, if you scroll through this code, you can see that it's got a whole bunch of predefined styles for our HTML elements. For example, the body or the horizontal rule or the H1 through to H6. And this isn't new for us. We've seen that inside the browser, we've got this thing called user agent style sheet, which is the CSS that gets applied to our websites by the browser. Now, in addition to that, if you include Bootstrap on your website, then it will change the style of your elements. So if you use a horizontal rule while using Bootstrap, then it will look like this, and it will override some of those browser-based styles. But more importantly to how Bootstrap works is that it's got a whole bunch of classes that they have styled and specified code for. So that means that if you add a particular class name, then it will automatically style it in the way that has been specified by the Bootstrap code. So let's see that in action. I want to show you one of the components that you see a lot on Bootstrap websites, and this is the Jumbotron. This is basically just a header for your website, and you can see that they've already specified styles, for example, the padding, the margin, the background color, the border radius, and all we need to do is just go into our code and add this class. So I'm going to delete the button class, and I'm going to create a div that has a class called Jumbotron. And inside this div, I'm just going to create a H1 that says hello world, because remember that divs have no dimension themselves unless they have some content. So let's hit run. And you can see that we've got this brilliant Jumbotron that is going to occupy, and I can pop this out to show you what the website would look like as it is. So you've got this header, which is the Jumbotron, and you've got your H1, which has been styled by Bootstrap to have a different font and different size from what you would normally see if you just had HTML. And all I needed to do to get all of this was just to include the class Jumbotron. Now, if you have a look on Bootstrap and you go into the documentation and look through its components, you'll find that there is the Jumbotron, and they tell you exactly how you can use this particular class to get something that looks like this or like this, just by including some of their pre-specified classes. So if you wanted to recreate this design here, then you could just copy their code snippet and paste it into here. And because we've already got Bootstrap installed on this playground, then if we just hit run, and we can pop this out, you can see that you've got this enabled on your website, and that was literally zero effort. So if you liked this particular format, then you could just go in here and change the text and change the background color, for example, and you would already have a pretty nicely styled website. Now, that's not all. If you go into Bootstrap and you go to examples, you can see that they've created more extensive components using Bootstrap. For example, if you ever wanted the Apple website designed, then you can simply look at their product example. And in fact, if you go into that download that you had previously for Bootstrap 4.0, and you go into Docs and you go into 4.0 or 4.1 or whatever your version may be, then you go into examples, then you can see it's got all of the examples that they show here. For example, pricing, checkout, product, album. And if you open up index.html, you can see that this is what the site looks like. And you can view all of the code that was required to create this inside Atom. So this is the HTML that they wrote, and this is some custom CSS that modifies the Bootstrap and customizes it a little bit. So say if this is the website that you wanted to make, so say you wanted to make a company that was an Apple ripoff like Grapple, then you could make this website by simply copying this product.css and index.html files and then modifying the text. So for example, this is the H1. You could just change it to whatever you want to call it for your website, Grapple. And now if you refresh, here's your website. So you can modify a lot of these examples very easily, or you can simply add these components by copying the code into your website. But instead of just modifying these examples, let's take it step by step so that we really understand what we're doing. And I want to show you exactly how Bootstrap works so that you can not just, rip off these designs, but you'll be able to design any sort of layout or design that you want by fully understanding this framework. So the first thing that we need to do is that we need to know how we can install Bootstrap onto our websites when we're not using something that's preloaded up like on CodePlay. So in the next lesson, we'll be showing you all the different ways how you can install Bootstrap onto your own websites. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now,
hiểu Bootstrap hoạt động kiểu gì không?
Rồi, hiểu.
Tức là bình thường thì mình tạo class của mình xong rồi mình vào code cái class đó, đúng không? Trong Bootstrap là nó có những class sẵn rồi, mình gọi cái muốn nó như thế nào, gọi đúng cái class đấy à, kiểu ngược lại ấy.
in the last lesson, we spoke about all the amazing things that you can do with Bootstrap and how generally awesome it is. So in this lesson, I want to show you how exactly do you get access to this awesome library? How do you install it into your website projects? So to do that, let's head into Atom and let's add our web development project folder in here so that we can create a new folder called Bootstrap installation. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a new file called index.html. Now that we have this new website, we can go ahead and create the HTML boilerplate and give our website a title, Bootstrap installation, and under the title, which is usually where we put in our links that linked to our style sheets, for example, this is where we can add the Bootstrap framework. So if you head over to getbootstrap.com, you can see that they've got a whole page that's dedicated to how you can install Bootstrap, and it's super, super easy. So the simplest way is just to copy the Bootstrap CDN and paste it into here. And all that this does is that when your browser reads through this code to try and load up the website, once it gets to this line, it goes over to this URL and downloads the Bootstrap files if the user doesn't already have it cached on their browser. So I just want to quickly explain firstly what a CDN is. So CDN stands for Content Delivery Network, and the concept is really simple. So do you remember how previously we looked at how the internet is delivered through all of these submarine cables, right? So for example, if the server for my website is in the US, say in the West Coast, and I try to access my website from the UK, then I would probably need to go through one of these transatlantic cables, and then there'll be some more wires that goes across the land, and that request reaches my server over here. And then once that request is received, then it has to send back all of those files, the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, back through all of those routes and back to me, to my browser, so that it can be displayed on my website. Now, as you can imagine, if that is the only location where your website exists, then that's quite a long route to travel. And even though these are pretty fast cables, it still generates a delay of, maybe a few milliseconds, or if there's a lot of data that I need to fetch over, like images or videos, then it might be a delay of a few seconds. And I don't know about you, but I generally don't wait for a website to load beyond maybe like 2 seconds, at which point I presume, it's probably down or there's probably some problems. So this is where a content delivery network comes in. So instead of hosting your website just in a single location, say over here, you actually have a whole bunch of points where that website can be accessed. So that means that if my request starts off from the UK, then it will look for the location that is of the shortest distance to get that website delivered. And that dramatically cuts down on the latency or how long it takes for your website to load up. And in terms of Bootstrap, they've hosted their Bootstrap CSS files on Max CDN, which has a whole number of routing points across the world. So that means when your users are trying to load up your website that's using Bootstrap, then it can access it relatively quickly, no matter where in the world they are. So that's a quick lowdown on CDNs. And that means that when your browser reaches this link, it'll look for the shortest route to download this CSS file if the user doesn't already have it. Now, because Bootstrap is one of the most popular frameworks that a lot of modern websites will have, then it's very, very likely that your users will have already downloaded this CSS file because they've loaded up a website that uses the same file. And when that happens, your browser actually caches it, so it saves a local copy so that you don't have to download it every single time. And that's one of the other advantages of working with Bootstrap. Because it's so common, because it's so popular, your users will probably already have this file on their browser cached, then it will again cut down on the latency. So now this is one way of installing Bootstrap onto our website. And now if I go ahead and add a H1, for example, then you'll see that it gets styled using the Bootstrap framework. So let's copy the full path, go to our browser and paste this in. You can see that this font is different. So say if I go ahead and comment this out, so I'm going to highlight this line and select Command / or Control / on Windows, hit save, and we go back over here and we refresh, then you can see this is our default HTML styling, which is this serif font that looks kind of ugly. But with Bootstrap, it looks a little bit nicer. Now, the other way that you can add Bootstrap to your website, especially if you're creating a website from scratch, is to just copy and use their starter template. You can see that it's got the HTML5 declaration, it's got all of the things that you normally need in your website, the character set, the Bootstrap CSS, it's got a title already added for you, the body, an H1, which you can delete if you don't need. And then at the bottom, it's got some Bootstrap JavaScript and jQuery. Now, we're going to be learning about JavaScript and jQuery in the next modules, but for some of the components in Bootstrap to work, they actually need some JavaScript. So for example, if something has to change in appearance on your website, so for example, like a drop-down menu, then this actually needs a little bit more code than just HTML, CSS, because this is kind of a functionality, right? And that's what this JavaScript and jQuery is going to help achieve. So if you wanted the complete set, and for everything that you'll implement in Bootstrap to work, then the easiest way is just to simply paste in the starter template, and now you will have everything that you need in order to start using Bootstrap. Now, the third way of installing Bootstrap is to simply download the CSS and JavaScript source code so that you can include it into your website. So instead of pointing to a URL on the internet, you can point to a relative URL that will be included with your website. So for example, you might say, go into this CSS folder and find bootstrap.css. And this is what I want to use for my website instead. Now, the downside to this is that this negates any sort of caching that a user will have. Because this is a completely separate file, the browsers will not recognize this and will not know that it's already been downloaded and already been cached. So it will have to download all of these files when it tries to load up your website, which leads to possibly a little bit more latency. So throughout this course, we'll be working with the easiest way of using Bootstrap, which is simply to get it through the CDN. And usually I tend to advise just when you're starting out creating the websites using Bootstrap, it's just to load up the example code. And this means that you'll have everything in there ready to go. And it was only one copy and paste away. So that's my recommendation. But of course, it's completely up to you how you decide to do it. In the next lesson, we're going to look closer at how we can design our website and start replicating the designs using Bootstrap. So I'll see you there. Now, we've seen how to install Bootstrap and what it can do, but before jumping headfirst into designing our website, the first thing I want to talk about is what the workflow of a web designer might look like. And a lot of times, if you're working as a web designer, one of the first things that you will do before touching any code, any CSS, or even creating your HTML structure, the first thing that you need to do is to wireframe. Now, wireframes are a low fidelity representation of your design. So it's meant to be done with a pencil, a piece of paper, and it's meant to be really quick. The idea is that say if you're an architect and you wanted to build a house, you wouldn't go ahead and just build the house straight away, right? You might then discover that, oh, actually I created the roof that's too big for this room, or the windows are too big for the wall, and you end up with a whole bunch of problems that's going to be very, very costly and time consuming to fix later on. And this is exactly the same with websites. Before you write down any code, you want to be able to get buy-in on your designs and be able to iterate through your design process. So you might want to create one version using your wireframe, see if, other people like it. If you're working for somebody, that will be your boss. If you're not working for anybody, then it might be friends or colleagues. But essentially, you want to be able to settle on a design before you go ahead and implement it. And that's what wireframing is perfect for. Now, it's meant to be low fidelity, so it's meant to look really, really simple, and it shouldn't take you too long to produce. Now, the opposite of this is what's called a mock-up. Now, a mock-up is meant to be a high fidelity representation of your app or your website's design. And it's almost like you've gone into the future, you've taken a screenshot of what it looks like while it's in action, and you've brought it back into the present to try and show people what it looks like. Now, the great thing about mock-ups is that they are really pretty much what you see is what you're going to end up getting. And if you are getting somebody else to create your website, then it's nice to have a mock-up to show them exactly how you want it to look. Now, the problem with this is that if this is the first thing you start messing around with, you end up getting really stuck on choosing the colors or the icons or which images to include in the mockup, and it really bogs you down. So the classic workflow is to start off by looking at other people's websites, which will give you a good idea about the layout and the structure, and then looking at some UI patterns. So going to a website like ui-patterns.com and looking at their design patterns. And you think about, the problems that you're actually trying to solve as you're designing your website. So for example, if you needed to have a carousel or basically a slideshow, because the user needs to browse through a set of items and possibly select one of them, then you can see some of the examples that they've picked up, for example, from Amazon or from other places, and look at, the solution and the rationale. And this is a really, really good website for understanding how other people have solved problems using web design and to be inspired for your own designs. Then the next step is to create a simple sketched wireframe for planning the layout and seeing where everything is going to be. Then the optional next step is to create a mock-up. So to go into the Sketch app or use something like Photoshop or Illustrator to create really sort of photorealistic versions of your future website. And finally, if you really, really wanted to go the extra mile, then you can actually create what's called a prototype. So an animated version of your website that really shows off what exactly it's going to look like. Now, a really good resource for looking for inspiration on all of these fronts is a website called Dribbble, which is a place where designers put up their portfolios. So for example, if you just search for something like website, you can come across some really, really beautiful designs that people have created as a part of their job. And also there's prototypes and there's a whole bunch of animations, and it's just a really, really nice place to get inspiration. And a really cool thing about Dribbble is that you can even search Dribbble by color. So you can specify a tone that you quite like, and you can narrow down all of the designs by that particular shade. So this is a really, really cool place where you can get lost for hours and hours, and it's a fantastic starting point to get inspiration for your web design. So let's do the same for our website. Let's start off by creating a wireframe. So how would you go about doing this? So in order to create wireframes, the easiest thing that I tend to recommend is just to use pencil and a piece of paper. Now, if you want, there's a website called Sneak Peek It, and they have these beautiful templates that you can download and print out for browsers or for mobile or for tablets. And you can start drawing on these printouts in order to wireframe your website. And they're free to download. And once you click on download, you get a zip file which you can open up and print out and start wireframing. Now, if you want to be a little bit more advanced in wireframing, then pretty much the industry standard tool is Balsamiq. And I've been using this for a number of years, and it's really, really nice. It's quick, it's really, really easy, and the best part is that it's really collaborative. You can share your designs with, say, somebody who commissioned you to design the website, or you can share it with friends and family or your colleagues, and they can add notes and add comments or change the designs as they need. So it's really, really cool. So we're going to create a wireframe for our upcoming website for our startup so that we know exactly what we need to do when we start coding. So go ahead and either sign up for a free 30-day trial if you want to use Balsamiq, or if you don't, then just go ahead and download and print out some of these wireframe sheets so that you can follow along with me. So I'm just going to log in, and I'm going to create a new project. So this is my new project, and this is my new wireframe, which is what I'm going to edit. So I'll click on that to open up my canvas. And it's pretty easy to get going. I can just hold down R and start creating a box. I can change the box from rectangle to maybe a browser window. And now I've got a lovely browser window that I'm going to start designing. So on my website, I would first like to have maybe a header section. So let's create a rectangle up here. And this header section is going to have a nice bright color. And then here I'm also going to have maybe a mobile phone, maybe over here somewhere, down here. So let's change that to a phone, iPhone maybe. Looks good. So we'll use that to show off our app that our startup is developing. So we can put that on the right over here. And then maybe I'll have a section that's maybe some menus over here. So let's just go ahead and search for a link bar. So here's our link bar, and we can put it up here on the right. And then maybe we want the link bar to be a little bit more in so that they're aligned on the right. And on the left, maybe I'll add a brand. So maybe like the logo for my company. So I'll just hold down Y and create a large text that maybe looks a little bit like the logo. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then down here, maybe I'll have a little bit more text. So like a large sort of telling people what my app is all about over here. Let's make that maybe left aligned, maybe make that all aligned together. And then finally at the bottom, I probably will want to have some buttons. So let's look for a button and drop it down here. Maybe one will be download on Android, the other one could be download on iOS, and let's use their guidelines to put that in. So that's the top of our page, and we can just keep extending this browser by dragging it down and start designing the next parts of our page. So maybe we would have some images down here that shows off our features. So let's just go ahead and add some of those images in. So we can change our rectangle to an image. And we can copy and paste a number of these into the website. And then we'd probably need a little bit of explainer text underneath. So I'm just going to hold down T and start dragging. Maybe we would need like 2 lines, something like that. And then we can copy that as well and get a few of these for each of our images, and this would basically show off the features of our website. And basically you will just continue designing your website until you're happy with how it looks. So you can search through here for whatever you need, like buttons or images or menus, or you can just navigate through these little different tabs to see what it is that you need. And I want you to create a wireframe for your ideal startup website so that in the future, if you create a website, you'll know how to wireframe it so that you have a guide as to how you should design up your website when you start coding it up. So I'm going to do the classic thing where I show you, here's one that I made earlier, and this is the mock-up for our Tin Dog project. And basically I've split it into sections so that we've got maybe a header section, a features page, maybe some testimonials, maybe some press that we've had for our startup, pricing table, another call to action at the bottom to try and get people to download it, and finally you've got your social icons, etc. And this took me maybe about 10 minutes to create. So it's very, very quick, and it's meant to be rough and ready to show you the layout. We don't want to focus too much on the sort of mock-up side of things where we get everything looking pixel perfect, because we're going to do that anyways later on when we create our website. Now, if you want, you can create your wireframes in Balsamiq. Alternatively, if you don't want to give them your email, then you can just print out the templates from SneakPeek and draw it by hand as well. So if you have designed anything particularly fantastic, I want to see it in the Q&A section so that we can judge who has the best designs for this theoretical startup that you're going to make. And points are awarded for not only great web design, but also for how crazy your startup ideas can be. So pause the video and give this challenge a go. Now, in the next lesson, we're actually going to go about implementing all of this design using Bootstrap by hooking it up with various components. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.
Vẽ bằng Royal mệt với lìn.
So now that we've designed our wireframes and we're happy with the layout and the structure of our website, then it's time to turn this design into the real thing. And in this module, we're going to be focusing on how we can recreate this design by using a lot of the features and components in Bootstrap. And through building this website, I'm going to show you all of the cool features of Bootstrap and how you can customize it and change it to your needs. So in the coming lessons, we're going to be recreating this entire page and its design using Bootstrap. So the first thing I want to tackle is this navigation bar up here. So I want to put in a nav bar at the top where we have links to the different sections of our website. So that, for example, if I clicked on a company or something, it would scroll down to that section where it's relevant to. And this is usually the navigation that you see in these single page landing pages. And in order to put in that navigation bar, we're going to be using Bootstrap. Now, because Bootstrap is a library, which means that it contains reusable bits of code that we want to put into our project. Now, sometimes with libraries, you might have written them yourself. So for example, if you particularly liked a button that you created in CSS, then you might want to reuse that bit of code by putting it into a separate file and dropping it into your project when you want to use it. Now, because this library is created by a third party, so it's somebody that we don't know, it was originally made by the team at Twitter, but since then it's had a large number of contributors, and you can actually take a look at their core team as well as how many people contributed to this library. But the point is that in order to use this library that somebody else created, then we need to look at the documentation and we need to see what are the guidelines and what are the rules that we need to know about in order to use their components and their features. So the first thing that we're going to do is head over to documentation, and we're going to go over to components, and you're going to navigate to navbar, and this is what we're going to add into our website, something that looks similar to this. And we're first going to create it and test it out in a CodePlay playground. So I'm going to create a brand new one. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to change the Bootstrap version from 3.3 to 4.0, which is so that we're up to date with the latest version. Now, inside HTML5, there is an element called the nav element. And this is kind of similar to a div, but semantically it's more clear what it is that you're creating and what it is that this section of code does. So that means if somebody else comes along and they see the nav section with the nav element, then they're going to know this is probably going to be the code that's related to the navigation bar. So if I run it right now, you'll see that nothing happens, because similar to a div, if the nav doesn't have any content, it doesn't have any dimensions. So let's change that. Let's create a new unordered list inside which we're going to have a single list item. And this list item is going to be one of our menu icons. So maybe we'll want a contact link inside our navigation bar. So now if I run the code, you can see I've just got a single bullet point that says contact, and this looks nothing like a navigation bar yet. So we can start using the Bootstrap classes, and we're going to add those classes to our nav element, just as they've shown here in their documentation. So the first one that we're going to add is the nav bar. And if we have a look inside that bootstrap.css file that we downloaded earlier, and let's search for nav bar, then you can see that by adding that class, then we include all of these CSS rules and apply it to this navigation element. And you can see what it does is that it changes the position to relative, it makes the content justified, it adds a little bit of padding, and it also adds some alignment and further positioning rules. Now, in addition to that, we're going to apply some other styles to the other elements inside our code. So we're going to change the UL to have a class of navbar-nav, and the LI is going to have a class of nav item. And you can see that this is all from the documentation here, where you can see that UL has that class navbar-nav and the LI has the class nav item. And you can also check over here in the actual source code to see what applying each of these styles actually does. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and hit run, and we can see that we've now got a completely different style based on those 3 different classes that we just added. Now, the text in our navbar is probably going to be a link, right? We want to be able to click on it and to scroll to a particular section in our website. For example, contact, maybe we'll go down to the bottom where we've got icons for Twitter, Facebook, email, etc. So this can't just be plain text, and instead we should change it into an anchor tag. So let's create an anchor tag that has the class of nav link, and this will make our text look more like a link so that when I hover over it, it changes color, etc. So we've got the class and we need an href for this to be a valid anchor tag, and I'm just going to leave that empty. And finally, I'm just going to close off the tag and add a link text called contact. And now if I run the code, you'll see that Bootstrap has styled this completely differently, and that when I hover over it, it appears as a link by changing the color and also showing that little pointer. So we've managed to create a very simple navigation bar just by adding a few classes and following the structure that Bootstrap wants us to use. So let's go ahead and add a few more links. So I'm just going to copy these link items and paste 2 more in here. So let's say that the second one is pricing, and the third link in our menu is just download. And now let's run our code, and you can see that the strange thing is that it's made our navigation bar vertical. So each navigation item is vertically stacked on top of each other. Now, that's not really what I designed it to be. I wanted it to be horizontal like this, and also like this. So in order to do that, we need a class called navbar-expand. And this will expand the navigation items depending on how large the screen is. So let me show you that by adding the code. So we're going to add navbar expand, and we're going to say large. So when I run this code, you'll see that in the current viewport, which is kind of the desktop size, so laptop or desktop, where you've got quite a lot of width, you can see that all the links are horizontally displayed next to each other. Now, when I go into a smaller size, say on iPad or on iPhone, then it stacks vertically so that it uses more of the real estate and it's easier to see. Now, as they specify here, you can change that, whether if it's large or medium or small, to specify at which point it should go into the vertical. So for example, if I change this to medium and I run, now you can see that on a desktop, on a laptop size, it is horizontal. Tablet size, it's still horizontal, but smartphone size, it goes into vertical. So you can change that by just changing the keyword here. So in my case, I'm going to stick to large because we're going to add a drop-down menu a little bit later on. Now, the next thing I want to show you is that our navbar is not very obvious at the moment. It just looks like I've got 3 links. I don't actually see any sort of bar. Well, you can add the style of the navbar to make it look something like this by simply adding a background. And we're going to use background light here. So let's add a background light class and hit run. And you can see now our navbar has this light background and it shows more clearly where the navbar is and where the rest of the content is. Now, in addition to that, you can change the actual style of the navbar so that it's not blue, and we can change the navbar to have a light style. Hit run, and you can see that this looks more similar to this because we're using the navbar light style of navbars as they showed in the documentation. Now, Bootstrap by default has a number of colors, and you can see it most obviously if you go into the buttons documentation and they show you all the names of the colors. So you've got primary, which is blue, and that kind of comes from the Twitter days where their primary color was always light blue color. Secondary is gray, success, danger, warning, info, light. So we can use any of these colors just by using those words. So for example, if I wanted the background to be red, then I can say background danger, hit run. You can see it turns red. Or if I wanted it to be yellow, then I can say background warning, hit run. And I can change them to all of these colors that you see here just by using their names. Now, in our case, I want to use a navbar dark. I want to change the background to dark as well. Now let's hit run, and you can see we've got this black background with a white-ish navbar. So that style comes from these 2 classes. Now, what if, like over here, I want to have a brand, say the name of my company or the logo? How can I implement that? Well, we can read through the documentation, and you'll see that all we need to do is add a class called navbar brand. And it tells you that it can be applied to most elements, but an anchor tag is the best thing to apply it to. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. So outside of the unordered list, I'm going to add a new anchor tag, and it's going to have a class of navbar brand, and it's going to have an href of empty string, and then I'm going to close off that tag and call it TinDog after our brilliant company. So let's hit run, and you can see that we've now got the brand, which is styled slightly differently from the links to be able to differentiate it. And that and all of this styling and all of these components comes free from Bootstrap just by adding these classes in. So I hope you're getting the hang of this. So now that I've got all the items on my navbar, but if we take a look at our design, we wanted the brand to be on the left and we wanted all the links to be on the right. So there's a little bit of space between them. But in our case, they're all kind of huddled together and that doesn't look very nice. So how can we shift all of these links over to the right? Well, let's first identify the container that holds all of these links. And it shouldn't be hard to see that would be the unordered list. So that separates this group from the anchor tag, which is our navbar brand. Now, in order to move this unordered list over to the right, all we need to do, again, is to just add another class. And we're not going to need to write any CSS of our own to style this navbar. So what I want there to be a margin between these sets of links and our brand. So Bootstrap has a nice class called margin left ml-auto. And if I hit run, you'll see that what that class does is that it adds a margin to the left of this group of unordered list. And the auto means that it will add as much margin as it needs to in order to push this group right next to the edge of the screen. So this is looking a lot better and a lot closer to what we've got in our design here. Now there's just one thing that's not quite ideal. At the moment, when we go from laptop to tablet, our navigation bar changes into the vertical format. Now, wouldn't it be so much better if when it gets too small to show all of these 3 links, to simply have a drop-down menu where we can see all of these links rather than have them take up so much space in the navigation bar? Well, how would we do that? Let's take a look at the documentation on Bootstrap. So we can scroll or simply select the toggler. Now, what the toggler does is that if you watch as I reduce the size of this navigation bar, then you'll see that eventually it gets to a size where it's so small that it can't actually fit all of these links in the same line. Now, you could either make the text smaller or make it vertically stacked on top of each other, as we've got at the moment. Or the more intelligent way is having this button show up, which is called a hamburger menu because it looks, or somebody once thought it looks like a hamburger. Personally, being a hamburger connoisseur, I think it looks nothing like a hamburger. There's only so many fights you can fight. So let's go ahead and click on that. And you can see it creates this drop-down menu where we can now view all of those links that are hidden. And this makes the design really, really clean and also makes the best use of the size of the screen. Because on a mobile phone, you probably don't want a bunch of tiny links bunched up in the same line. It'll be really, really hard to read. And instead, you want to have this nice drop-down menu. So how can we implement this in our code? Well, let's see what they did. They added a button which is going to act as that hamburger menu button. And when you click on it, it's going to target something called Navbar Toggler Demo 02, which you can see is this thing here. So they've created a div that contains everything that is collapsible and put it inside that div. And they've given it the class of collapse, navbar collapse, and given it an ID that can be targeted by this button. Now, let's see if we can do the same thing in our code. So I'm just going to straight up copy this button over to here, and I'm going to put that just below our nav element. And the next thing I want to do is create that div. Now, the location where you create the div is really, really important. So first, I'm going to show you what it looks like when I create the div here, and I'm going to surround the brand as well as all of our links. So the div is going to have a class of collapse, navbar collapse. Now, sometimes you realize that Bootstrap really could have made their class naming a little bit more succinct. You end up writing a lot of navbar, navbar collapse, but this is just the way that Bootstrap works. And there are other frameworks which have more succinct names for their classes. But once you understand how Bootstrap works, it's quite easy to pick up any of these other front-end frameworks. They all work in a really, really similar way. So now we've got this div class called collapse, navbar collapse. And I'm going to put the closing div just after our unordered list so that the unordered list, so all of these three links, as well as our brand, is enclosed in the collapsible section or the collapsible div. And the final thing we need to add before our navbar is going to work is that we need that ID, because the button is targeting this specific ID. So it knows that when you click on this button, which div to collapse or uncollapse, because you could have many of these collapsible sections on the same website, and you need something specific so that the code knows which parts to collapse and which parts not to collapse. So let's add that ID over here. Now, of course, you can name your ID whatever it is that you want. As long as it's the same as the data target in your button, then it should work just fine. So let's hit run. And you can see now, if I switch over to the phone sized, all of the content in my navbar disappears, including the navbar brand and all three of my links, because we have enclosed all of them inside this collapsible div. So now, if I click on this button, you'll see a drop-down menu and a nice little animation that shows everything that's contained in that collapsible area. So in my case, I would actually rather like my brand to still show up when it is in the mobile size. So I'm going to take out my navbar brand, or rather this anchor tag. So I'm going to cut. So it matters a great deal where you place that navbar brand, because if you paste it below the button that is our toggle button, then when you hit run, you'll see that the brand appears on the right and the toggle appears on the left. Now, if you place this anchor tag for your brand above the button, however, then you hit run and their positions get swapped. So the first thing that gets rendered is the navbar brand, then we render the button. So this is something to be aware of. And in our case, we actually want the brand to be on the left and the menu icons to be on the right. So this is the format that we're looking for. So now we've got this brilliant navbar where it expands to have all the links on the right when it's in a large display, so a laptop or a desktop, and when we're on a smartphone or a tablet, then it shrinks down into a toggle button, which we can show or unshow our navigation menu. Now, there's a number of other things that you can do with the navigation bar. So for example, you can have a drop-down link, like so, just by adding the class drop-down to your list item and have a link that is the drop-down toggle, and then you have a div with all the items that will be inside the drop-down. So you're basically just copying this list item and modifying it to your needs to specify how you want your drop-down to look like. Now, you can also affect the position of the navbar by changing it to navbar fixed top. So that means when you scroll through your website, it will stay at that position and it won't disappear off the screen. Or you can have it fixed to the bottom so that you've always got it at the bottom, and you can just copy this code to get this positioning and placement behavior. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to be looking at the grid system, and we're going to start to build up our TinDog website. So there's a lot more fun stuff yet to come, and I look forward to seeing you on the next lesson. Now, you've heard of Tinder, but have you heard of TinDog? That is the question that we're going to answer in the coming lessons. So in the coming lessons, we're going to be using Bootstrap and more advanced CSS to create this beautiful startup landing page. It will have a title section, as well as features sections, a carousel to browse testimonials, a pricing plan section, and a call to action where you get your users to download your app, and finally a nice little footer with your socials. So this is a startup website fit for any startup, and by building it, we'll get to know all of the cool features that Bootstrap offers, and we'll learn some more advanced CSS along the way as well. So I hope you're excited, because I'm super excited to show you how to create this. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and we'll get started.
Cái này cũng tính như là làm project được đây, nên là nếu được thì cứ làm đi. Với tao hôm trước làm cái bài bài web hôm trước ấy.
Bạn mày out rồi Châu.
Nó bảo bận nó nào à?
Thế hôm nay nghỉ sớm cũng được. Mệt quá.
Wow. Tao gửi link vào trong chỗ study rồi nha. Alo.
Thấy rồi.
Ý là tao nghĩ là bọn mày cũng nên làm cái này luôn. Mấy cái trước thì nó là cơ bản nên không quan trọng, nhưng cái này thì bọn mày nên đưa vào GitHub ấy.
Ok.
Của chính mình ấy.
Nhưng mà thực sự là tao vẫn chưa quen dùng GitHub ấy. Mày thử làm một khóa GitHub coi nào.
Có GitHub, từ đấy nha.
Để bữa sau làm đi, địt mẹ hôm nay. Đấy.
Ok, hôm sau
Qua rồi, nó qua rồi. Tao cũng có biết gì đâu, tao mới
thì mày nói qua những cái gì mày biết thôi, tại vì tao cũng nhìn vào tao cũng chả hiểu lắm ấy.
Đây.